Go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's GPN webinar. We're very excited to have you here. My name is Christina Sabochik, and I will be moderating the session. I currently work at the National Forest Foundation, which is the officially chartered nonprofit supporting the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm on the GIS team there as a geospatial analyst. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Breece Robertson, and I will be reading an introduction and then handing it over to her for her presentation. So Breece Robertson is a nationally recognized leader in geospatial strategy, climate resilience, and conservation planning. With over 25 years of experience, she's designed and led transformative initiatives that use GIS, data, and Earth observation to advance sustainability, restoration, and environmental justice. From building the pioneering Park Score, Park Serve, and Climate Smart Cities programs at the Trust for Public Land, to expanding global reforestation impact at One Tree Planted, Breece blends visionary strategy with grounded implementation. Through her consulting practice, she helps organizations, agencies, and foundations drive system-level change by aligning strategy, programs, and evaluation around measurable impact. Her work fuses strategic program design, change management, and compelling storytelling to turn insight into action. Whether advising on climate intelligence, campaigns, or cross-sector initiatives, Breece brings clarity, creativity, and purpose to every engagement. She is the author of Protecting the Places We Love, published with Esri Press in 2021, and has been honored with Esri's Special Achievement in GIS and the Making a Difference Award. When she's not working on strategy and systems change, Breece recharges by exploring trails, back roads, and wild places with her partner and pups. Thanks for being here, Breece, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Christina. And I'm so excited to be here with all of you, my fellow geospatial community. And apologies, my video is not working and we could not figure that out. So I think it's on my side. But yes, really appreciate you all being here today. So today I'm going to talk about guiding conservation and resilience actions now and for the long view, of course, using geospatial technologies. So my favorite places are those places that are wild, vast, places where I can go, quote unquote, get lost and explore. Places where I can sit and ponder things and places where I can learn about the natural environment. And I've had the opportunity to explore these places from desert environments to the tallest peaks. And I spend quite a bit of time down in marine areas in Baja, Mexico. So I felt very grateful to have found a career in what I'm passionate about, which is that intersection of conservation, restoration, and geospatial technologies. So to give you a little bit more about my background, I started out teaching GIS for a company called All Points GIS, and I learned about the Trust for Public Land within one of my teaching engagements. And the Trust for Public Land's mission really aligned with my values around conservation, community, and sustainable development. So I joined the Trust for Public Land and was able to actually build their GIS program from the ground up for an organization whose land or business is in land. They did not have a GIS system when I started. And so I spent 18 years at TPL evolving the GIS unit within the Trust for Public Land, and then also bringing in planning, research, and then we worked across all 40 offices and all programs and initiatives at the Trust for Public Land. So really building out this enterprise-wide geospatial system. And along that way, I always like to say I got to work from the main streets to the mountaintops. We worked on issues, hyper-local issues, and identifying where parks should go to help provide better or access in general to parks and open spaces and trails and greenways. And then we also worked on national level initiatives. So you can see the map in the center of the screen here. This was a map overlaying different demographic layers and park access information. So what really started out as sort of overlay maps started to feed policy around public health and parks. And then that turned into a national 10-minute walk to a park campaign. And so the work that we did with GIS at TPL really helped to fuel a lot of the Trust for Public Lands initiatives and programs, including climate smart cities. Christina mentioned Park Score. So we built Park Score about 11 years ago, I think. And that was the first ranking system for city park systems in the country. So it looks at the 100 largest cities and ranks their park and recreation system based on a bunch of different metrics, and also shows where people have access to parks and where they don't, and where parks would make the biggest impact in communities based on a variety of geospatial data layers. And parks were, it's really amazing. You know, mayors and cities across the country have really embraced Park Score. I was at 2 different conferences last year where the mayor came on stage to welcome us all to Atlanta, and then the other one was in Dallas. And the first thing they mentioned was how when they started, where they were on the park score scale and how much they had improved in their tenure. So it was fun to see how mayors and elected officials are using these geospatial tools to make their cities better places. And then out of Park Score grew this other project called Park Serve, because we wanted to go beyond the 100 largest cities and make this type of data available to virtually any community in the country. So this is all freely available data. So you can go to parkserve.org and type in your community, and you can get access to all of this really rich information about park access, demographics, urban heat islands, climate resilience related data. And we also partnered with several other organizations to develop the first national conservation easement database. So conservation easements, if you're not familiar with those, that's where private landowners enter into an agreement to manage and steward their land for conservation and restoration purposes. But we didn't have a sense of where are all of these privately held properties that have conservation easements on them. And so we um, engaged in this big challenge to actually create a database of all of those conservation easements across the country. So there's a website that you can go to check out the conservation easement database. And I will share this PowerPoint presentation afterwards, and you can see on this slide, I have a little link down here in the bottom right-hand corner. So you'll see that on a lot of my slides. So you'll have access to both the slides, and we'll be able to explore some of these tools after the presentation. So we all know that we, as a society, are really facing a lot of multidimensional problems. And we also know, problems can't be solved usually just by one approach. We need these multi-benefit solutions. So whether you're working on issues related to structural racism, climate change, food insecurity, health issues, all of these issues are so interwoven together. They don't stand alone. We live in these systems on the planet, and in these communities that are systems. And so multi-dimensional problems really need these multi-benefit solutions. And there's no better tool to look at these issues than GIS. Without GIS, it really would be so difficult to understand these different relationships, connections, and complexities of all of these different issues in our communities. So, for example, just recently in the last couple of weeks, our public lands were listed in the Senate reconciliation bill to that as eligible to be sold. And it's hard to wrap your head around these things when they come out in the news. What does that really mean? And so the Wilderness Society stood up a map really quickly, showing exactly what this means. So they mapped or created a map of all the BLM and US Forest Service lands that were going to be eligible for sale under that reconciliation bill. That has changed as of yesterday. So I think the number of lands, I think currently the US Forest Service lands are not on the table anymore, but BLM lands are. And these are a lot of our cherished legacy lands, where we recreate, where um, we go back for hunting and fishing, camping. And a lot of these lands also have important economic impacts to our communities. And so we're starting to see the Wilderness Society and others pull together all of this various data, both geospatial and statistical data, to be able to make the case for why we need to keep our public lands public and not sell those off. So there's just a lot of great work going on around the country around identifying what those economic impacts of public lands are and outdoor recreation, not only to the country, which you can see here, they are a really big part of our GDP, gross domestic product. They also create a lot of jobs, millions and millions of jobs in the country. And the Trust for Public Land just came out recently with um, a report that really focuses on mountain biking and the economic benefits of mountain biking to communities. And you can find these reports for all different types of outdoor activities, from fishing to hiking, to biking. So organizations are really stepping up and using GIS to help us understand what the implications of some of these new administrative decisions would be. And of course, I'm passionate about public land, so I do not want to see any of our public land sold off. In fact, I think we need to conserve more lands to meet our goals for biodiversity protection and also people's access to public lands. And so in thinking about that, the actions that we take locally really can make a big difference in what's happening at a regional scale and even a continental scale. So in this example, the map is showing the Galisteo Basin, which is a place that is just 15 minutes south of where I live. And the blue outline is showing the Galisteo Basin outline or boundary. And then all of the colored parcels in there are places or parcels that are protected in one way or another, whether it's protected by the city, the county, the state, or by conservation easements. And then everything that's white on the map is not protected, so that's private land. And so this is an example of a key puzzle piece, if you will, that's so important to connectivity. So you've got the Sandia Mountains that are down to the southwest, in the southwest part of the map. And then you've got the start of the Rocky Mountains, which are up in the northeast part of the map. So you can see that the Galisteo Basin plays a really critical role in animals' abilities and species' abilities to migrate from these different mountain chains. So we've got black bear, mountain lion, antelope, butterflies, birds. I mean, you name it. There's so many species that use this corridor for migration. And then you can see in the map on the left of the Western Wildway how the Western Wildway effort goes from Mexico all the way up through Canada into Alaska. So this one relatively small area here close to home for me is so important and such a much larger connectivity corridor. And then speaking of these connectivity plans, we've really seen a big expansion in states creating their own wildlife corridor action plans. So this is an example of one in Virginia where they have worked with the Natural Heritage Institute and other partners to pull together data to showcase where you have a lot of wildlife vehicle conflict occurrences. So, crashes, car crashes, and there are a lot of deaths that happen in the United States due to wildlife vehicle crashes every year. And so these wildlife corridor plans are going to be really important ways to identify, what can we do? You can kind of see it here in these pictures. There's fencing here. There's an underpass. We also have, this is out west, and this is a real picture, by the way. This is not photoshopped. But this is in Colorado showing a moose using an overpass and a mule deer using an underpass. And so we're really starting to see a lot of implementation of these types of corridor assets that can really protect the animals as they migrate and move on their traditional paths, and also protect people as well. And then at the local level, so we've talked about sort of the continental level, connectivity, what's happening at states. There's a lot of work going on in cities and counties to develop conservation plans and climate plans. So in this example, this was a joint project between the Office of Sustainability in Richmond, Virginia, and with RVA Green Initiative in Richmond and Planning Communities, where they looked at climate impacts, vulnerabilities, and risk in Richmond, and then created recommended actions. And it was a heavily GIS-driven plan, and they looked at different scenarios. So they looked at the 2030s, 2050s, 2070s, and looked across a bunch of different data layers related to extreme heat, extreme precipitation, and both drought and flooding. And then they also looked at sea level rise. So they were able to create this sort of collection of maps that tells the story about how is Richmond going to fare in 2030, 2050, 2070 related to each of these different climate risks. And then out of that, they were able to drill all the way down to the infrastructure asset level so they could see how flooding in 2050 and beyond is going to affect actual places in Richmond. So whether it be schools, parks, playgrounds, city properties, hospitals, how are these different climate impacts going to affect the people and the places in Richmond, Virginia? And then out of that, the team was able to come up with some very actionable recommendations for implementation. So things like creating microgrids and backup power for critical facilities, creating more flood-resistant housing, and putting central AC in public housing and community facilities. So using GIS can really help the community and the city understand, where they should be spending their money that would have the biggest impact for the community members into the future. And then they were also able to identify how the outputs of this particular plan and these recommendations could flow into other plans, like their capital improvement plan, and some other actions that are happening there. They were doing a tree canopy assessment, for example. So how can the results of this GIS analysis help support that tree canopy analysis? So again, you'll have access to this after the presentation, this PowerPoint, and I have a link to a story map here that you can learn more about that project. So that's the city level. So you can kind of see what I'm doing, going from international, national, state, city, and then here we're at a hyper local scale. And I always love to show these pictures. So this is the Trust for Public Lands Community Green Schoolyards program. TPL has now completed, I think, over 300 of these in New York, and they've um, expanded their program out to many cities across the country. And so basically, we use GIS to be able to identify all the schools that did not have a playground at the school or near the school. And, this has broader implications for the community around the school too, because they also don't have access to parks or playgrounds. And so we prioritized and identified the schools to go in and create these beautiful green infrastructure parks. So you could see on the left, it was just a parking lot. This actually is where the kids played during recess. They had to move the cars around and kids would go to recess out there. Um, doesn't look very fun, does it? And so TPL worked with the school, with the children in the school and the surrounding communities, and with the city to develop these parks, to actually design them. And then working with the city, they were able to create agreements where these parks could be open to the public after school hours. And so this particular park, it's a green infrastructure park, which means it's got a lot of stormwater capture assets to it, or infrastructure to the park. So it actually captures stormwater, over 500,000 gallons of stormwater a year, just this one park. So that really helps with some of the flooding issues that were happening in this community. There's also trees that will help mitigate that urban heat island effect. And it really just looks like a fun place to play. So I really, really love to tell the story of these TPL Green Schoolyard projects. And then this is another place-based project in Los Angeles. So on the left, you can see an alleyway, which, doesn't look very inviting. And, LA also gets a lot of stormwater events. They have a lot of flooding there. Um, and there's over 900 miles of alleyways in LA. So that's a lot of mileage of alleyways that are really underutilized. And so the Trust for Public Land worked with partners and communities to create what they call the Green Alley program. So on the right, you can see the green alleyway. So again, this green alley absorbs stormwater. It has permeable pavers and other green infrastructure assets. It's a place where people can gather. You can see, they planted things in the alleyway. They can use the alleyway for transportation. And a lot of local community groups sprang up out of this process, like Equitable Verde, so Allies for Alleys. So the community members actually have taken ownership of these alleyways, and they get together, they clean them, they plant plants, they really use them as a gathering place and a place, a way to move around the city. So those are just some examples I wanted to share, kind of giving you a broad taste of how GIS is being used in conservation, restoration, and climate resilience at different scales. And, we can't do GIS really without engaging communities, especially during planning processes. And engaging communities and diverse partnerships, bringing those diverse partnerships into our planning processes really unearths these the deep collective knowledge of the community. And also that really helps to guide this collaborative and holistic, the investments and the implementations from the plans. And when we're talking about conservation projects, really any project, but I'm going to focus on conservation here. Um, a lot of times Native communities and indigenous communities are not included in these planning processes. So there's a big effort now to educate people about what traditional ecological and indigenous ecological knowledge is and how we might incorporate that into our conservation and restoration planning processes. So if you're not familiar with traditional ecological knowledge, here's a good definition from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's known as TEK or indigenous knowledge, and it can also refer to cultural knowledge. So places where people have lived for hundreds of years and they know a lot about the land through stories and information that's been passed down from generation to generation. So it really refers to the knowledge acquired by indigenous and local peoples over hundreds or thousands of years through direct contact with the environment. So they really understand the plants that live there, the different animals, what happens there ecologically, what kind of changes have they seen on those landscapes over time? How are those different lands used for cultural and spiritual and just general life ways for hunting, fishing, trapping, and agriculture and forestry? So this is a good definition, I think, for traditional ecological knowledge. And then there's also been a lot of work from different universities to develop information on how to think about bringing together the traditional Western science that we use in conservation in the United States with this traditional ecological knowledge. And there's a indigenous scientist and tree ecologist or arborist, Christina Eisenberg. She's out of the Oregon State University. She's been doing and leading a lot of this work and thinking about this as two-eyed seeing. So you can see in the chart there, Western science really has a different approach to thinking about conservation data analyses compared to traditional ecological knowledge. So for example, Western science tends to be more quantitative, whereas traditional ecological knowledge tends to be more qualitative. Western science can be exclusive, whereas traditional ecological knowledge can be more inclusive. So you can kind of see that these are somewhat opposites in some way. And so some of these, like Christina and others in the academic world and also in the practitioners world and conservation are really starting to make sure they bring these two different ways of looking at data science in the natural world together. They've also developed some guiding documents around principles and best practices for working with indigenous peoples in doing conservation and restoration work. So this is a link to a paper that came out of Oregon State University. It was a collaboration between many universities and the Forest Service and other agencies, both local, state, and federal, to come up with different practices and standards for working with traditional communities and indigenous communities. So this is a really great resource as well. And so bringing this back around to maps and how we integrate traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge into the mapping process. This is a story of a friend of mine, Stephanie Smith. She's the GIS director at Grand Canyon Trust. And she worked with the tribes on creating the boundaries for the Bears Ears National Monument in Southeast Utah. And when she showed up at the first meeting, you usually, if you're printing out maps and you're having, people mark up maps in meetings, you have to have a base map. And so her base map was that traditional base map that I think most of us create, where we bring on those boundary layers. So like state boundaries, county boundaries, roads, the different base map layers. And the indigenous people here, they really think about and engage with this landscape in a different way. Like they don't think about this landscape in terms of these arbitrary administrative boundaries. And so Stephanie and team kind of went back to the drawing board and they worked with the indigenous communities there to actually come up with this map, which is much more reflective of how the indigenous people engage with and think about this landscape. So we've got, different buttes and mountains, the rivers, more natural resources that are highlighted within that. And that also helped them make the case for expanding the boundaries of the Bears Ears National Monument. And I always like to say everyone speaks map. Maps give us a common language for planning. When you show up at meetings, it's just amazing when you put the map down on the table or you pull the map up on a screen, how many people gather around because maps can really pull people in and engage them. And this is an example of a map we created back when I was at the Trust for Public Land, where people are actually drawing different things on the map that we didn't have data layers for, so that we could create those data layers so that it really reflected the community's what the community wanted in their conservation plan. And then there are also different, you have to think about when you're doing these plans, who should be involved. So who is the community? Who are your stakeholders and partners that should be involved? Who are those technical experts, and who are going to be the implementers of your plan? So that would be like your elected officials and others that can actually make decisions around policy and funding of the plan. And you can see, maps are a big part of these engagement strategies, but there are also so many new and emerging, evolving technologies. We actually use keypads, and this was probably 8 years ago at the Trust for Public Land, where we would hand everybody a keypad in these community meetings, and they could use the keypad to vote on their conservation preferences. And then we could quickly just press a few buttons and have the GIS maps update based on those preferences. So people can see how their preferences update the maps in real time. And so today we have, new tools using our cell phones like Mentimeter, and other tools like that, where people, large groups of people can actually participate in working with that technology to see how their preferences are going to update conservation priorities in their communities. And then there are platforms like this, community engagement platforms that can show you, how many people are coming to the website, taking surveys, interacting with maps. And in this example, you can see that there were 2 public meetings where you had 34 attendees at the first meeting, 124 at the second meeting. But the third public meeting ended up being a virtual engagement, and they ended up having over 2,500 unique users and engage with the platform to provide their input. And then Esri actually has an ArcGIS dashboard prototype that you can use to create your own engagement tracker as an Esri dashboard or an ArcGIS dashboard. So here you can see the total number of events, how many people were connected with through those events, where those events took place, who led those events. So dashboards can just be a really great way to engage the community through Survey 123, which is embedded in there, but then also see those results real time. And then, of course, we all know about story maps. Those are also a great way to take a lot of detailed information and make it more digestible and understandable for the general public. We also, you can create really simple, fast, out of the box survey tools for people to use on their phones. In this case, we created a survey for people to go out and gather information about parks in the city of Dallas. And then some of these dashboards are also geared towards evaluation of metrics. So how are we doing? So we created a plan, we created some goals, and how are we doing towards implementing those goals? Are we on track? So you can see in those green boxes, those are places where this community is on track for these different measurements for buildings and energy. And the reds are places where they're not on track. And so this really gives people in the community information and an understanding of what needs to happen to implement these goals and metrics that they've set forward. And there's also there's so much data out there, but there are also still so many issues to accessing data and for people figuring out, okay, once I do access the data, what do I do with it? How do I use it? What level of expertise does my organization need to use information? And so one of those examples, something I've been working on for many years, is around trails in the US. There is no one authoritative trail data set in the US. So there's all trails, there's America Trails has some point data on trail partnerships. USGS has a Trail Explorer. OpenStreetMap has trail data, but they're all kind of siloed. They don't talk to each other. And so when people are doing any kind of geospatial trail analysis, sometimes it's hard to understand, where do I go to get trail data? Who's got the best data, and how can I use that? Another issue that we've seen recently in the last 6 months or so with this new administration is a lot of the data that we have relied on is disappearing off of websites. So if you're not familiar with the work of the public environmental data partners, they are working to preserve data sets. And then there are also tools like EJ Screen, EPA's EJ Screen, Justice 40 data, data from NOAA, data from NASA. There's a lot of data, weather data, climate data that have been taken down from federal websites. So this group is actually preserving that data, and they are pushing out the web applications again. So again, if you're not familiar with public environmental data partners, highly recommend checking them out. And if there are key data sets that you use that you're afraid might be taken down from federal websites, they have a place here where you can nominate data sets to preserve. And if you're also not familiar with some tools like this one, the mapping inequality redlining data from the University of Richmond, there are a lot of research facilities and universities that have data that they're using for their own research, but also that push it out through different web applications to make it accessible for all of us to use in our geospatial analysis. Trust for Public Lands, Park Serve data, we talked about that. That's publicly available for download, and you can also access it through the web application. Esri has data in the Living Atlas on equity and climate and other source. They also are a key source for a lot of these federal data sources. There are other entities like the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, which is a huge collaboration in the Southeast. They've created a conservation blueprint for the Southeast, and then the Nature Conservancy has their resilient land mapping tool. And NatureServe is They have just released a new version of the map of biodiversity importance. So they have all types of information about the taxonomy and diversity of species, as well as the risk for species across the country. And you can go to their website and interact with their data, download it. It's available through the Living Atlas too, and integrate it into your conservation plans. So I'm going to switch gears here and wind down pretty quickly because I do want to leave some time for questions. One thing that's really important in addition to using GIS for understanding issues, using it for decision support and creating plans, it's also really important to use our geospatial technologies to track and evaluate how we're doing and to monitor and report on how the outcomes of conservation and restoration. And yet you can see in this slide, I like this slide because it shows just how sometimes fragmentation of ecosystems can happen so slowly that we don't understand, the impacts until much of the ecosystem is really too fragmented to support certain species anymore. And so that's why digital monitoring, reporting, and evaluation is so important. So I'm going to go quickly through these slides, but just tell you a little bit about some of the new and emerging technologies around digital MRV monitoring, reporting, and verification. So there are all different types of monitoring. So you can see down here at the bottom of the slide, from collecting environmental DNA, which is literally, taking a sample out of a stream and being able to tell what types of species live in that stream based on DNA signatures that are detected in that water sample, to camera traps that are capturing images, sound recorders that are capturing bird calls and other wildlife sounds, drones. We've also got different types of UAVs, and then satellite imagery to do our monitoring work. And this is an example of monitoring for trees. And the different ways that are used. So there's actually being out there in the field, there's taking geotag photos with your phone, there's monitoring these trees with drones. And then you can see it really takes a tree about 3 to 6 years before satellites can really pick them up. But there are different ways that you can use the technologies along the spectrum of trees growing through their lifespan. So this is and you can see why you need different technologies. So this is a picture of a redwood seedling that was planted in California. So it's really small. Even a drone would have a hard time picking up that seedling as an image in their image, but the drone could probably pick up those flags. So there's different ways to get at capturing the data. And I love this picture of this redwood tree. People are out there measuring the tree the old school way with a tape measure. But there are some new technologies like AgriPoint. They have a app that captures an image and creates a 3D point cloud of whatever you're taking pictures of or videos of. And then that in turn creates an image and some statistics of those trees. So you can actually see the DBH there, how big is the tree, how many trees are there. It's detecting the different trunks. And then they also have algorithms that can detect or calculate all of these different measures around these trees or forests. So not only plant height, canopy diameter, but things like plant disease, tree disease, species, what types of species might be there. So these are basically creating digital twins of forests. And then this is a drone image. When I worked at One Tree Planted, we planted trees, mangrove trees down in Costa Rica. So it's showing 1 year after the trees were planted there, and then 2 years after the trees were planted. So you can really start to see the growth over time. And then drones can also really help give you context of the location where you're planting. So those are the planting holes there. And then tools like Upstream's Lens application can really give you great information about vegetation. You can look at change over time. So this is showing a area of a forest that burned in a forest fire in California, and it helps us to map, how much biomass was lost in that fire, and also monitor the regrowth patterns after the fires. And the Lens platform can also help you look at risk on the landscape. So things like ladder fuel densities, how much fuel is on the ground that could burn in a wildfire. And then that can help lead to better management decisions in our forests. And then this is an example of a place in Klamath in California showing this area that got clear cut. And so with these lens satellite imagery tools, they can actually detect these clear cuts for you and then send you a report on what they detected and what the outcomes are from those changes to the landscape. So some pretty real-time change detection using satellites. And then GIS, ArcGIS tools and others are also really helping us create storytelling tools. So what are the impacts of all this work that we're doing? How many, in this case, not only how many trees were planted, but how many families were benefited by that tree planting project? How many women might have been hired or species protected? And also gives you a place to tell the story about that project, but also catalog drone imagery and other footage of those restoration projects. And there's so many innovations coming out it seems like daily. It's hard to keep up with them, but especially in the climate and the reforestation community, AI is being used to identify trees, where trees are located, how many trees are there. There's some new technology where they've created new self-planting seeds, tree seeds, where they actually can be dispersed across the large landscape using drones. And then they have these little seed pod technologies that plant themselves. And then I love this one too. AI is being used to actually identify individual whales across the world, really. So whether you're looking at humpbacks or grays or blues, there's a couple of different websites. This is only one of them where they're actually downloading photographs that tourists are taking on whale watching tours, and they're able to identify individual whales using AI. So AI is being used, really, it's beginning to be used extensively in the conservation and environmental world. A lot of different uses of AI. But one thing to note is, you have to be careful with AI. I'm sure you all are all aware of this, but it presents many challenges around data quality, potential biases of the algorithms in the AI, and then ethical considerations, especially, if you're a conservationist. AI takes a lot of power and energy and water and to run those huge processing plants. And so there are a lot of considerations in using AI, but I would say we should not shy away from it because it can be extremely important in helping us do our work. So like in this picture in the top right, you can see how this camera trap is real time able to identify individual birds for a bird count. And then anonymized cell phone data is becoming more available. So we were using this at the Trust for Public Land, and we've also used it with American Trails to identify where people are coming from to use parks and trails, and some basic demographic information about those users. And then this is an example of how AI is being used to actually identify individual trees and their tree canopy heights. So, GIS, I know I'm speaking to the crowd here, but it really helps to give us better insights into the past, helps us do better planning and understanding of what's happening right now in the present, and then helps us, through those scenario planning examples of figuring out what we need to protect into the future and what risk our public lands and protected lands might be facing under different climate change scenarios. And it also helps us be proactive and strategic, helping our managers make better decisions, and provides increased visibility and accountability to the work that we do in conservation. So we are capable of so much more together, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I think we're going to leave some time for questions. I do want to let you know I wrote a book. That was my COVID project. And the book is available. If you don't have it, you can get it at Indie Pubs at 40% off with the code that's on the screen there, B. Robertson. So with that, Christina, I'll hand it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Breece, for such a wonderful and thorough and inspiring presentation. I definitely want to make sure we have time for questions. So folks, please put in the Q&A section of the webinar if you have any questions for Breece to answer. We did get one to start with, so I'll read this one to you, Breece, to answer live. How do you suggest getting involved with GIS at the local level as a new GIS professional?
That's a good question. Well, I'll give you an example here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I live. We have a local land trust called Santa Fe Conservation Trust. And, most conservation organizations are small and they don't have many resources and a lot of staff, but they need help. And so there could be organizations like that where you live, where, you can literally call them up and see, if they need help with creating a map or a story map. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to get involved through conservation organizations locally. They need the help.
Absolutely. That's a
And
great
I see
answer.
Wendy just said lots of topics will be discussed that are related in at GIS Pro in the Rockies. So yeah, hope to see y'all there too.
Totally. Anyone have other questions to share with us via the Q&A or the chat?
Yeah, I will say, it really is. The work that we do is so powerful. I think we day to day, we get into our work, and sometimes it might even feel like a grind some days, but even sometimes the simplest maps can make the biggest difference. So just like the map I showed of the Forest Service lands and the BLM lands, a lot of people just they don't know what things mean until you put it on a map and you show it to them and show them how, protecting these places can really bring a big impact to them. Or they might be the places people love to go camping or hiking, that type of thing. So our maps and our work really do make a big difference.
I love that. I think that's a really wonderful note to end on. So thank you very much, Breece. Um, I will have you stop sharing so I can swap over to some closing announcements to everybody.
Okay.
Let me just pull those up here very quickly. And I'll get this into presentation mode. Hopefully that's coming through okay for everybody. So Again, thank you all for coming. If you're new to the Geospatial Professional Network, this is a very vibrant community uniting both emerging and experienced GIS professionals through top-tier education, networking, career development, and more. And we're very happy that you're here. We hope to see you at other upcoming GPN webinars. There are 3 here listed on the screen that would be great to attend to keep building your knowledge. And you can see there's also a whole page on the GPN website of upcoming webinars. So always check that out for the most recent resources. There's also upcoming GPN programs, including both the Advanced GIS Leadership Academy and the Standard GIS Leadership Academy. So please keep an eye out for those. GPN also has a new learning annex that's full of lots of resources for continuing your professional growth and learning. So definitely check that out. And as mentioned already, don't forget about GIS Pro in the Rockies in October in Denver. Would love to see you there to keep building your network and learn from and get inspired by the other folks involved in the Geospatial Professional Network. And with that, just a reminder to join the organization today for access to this incredible network and lots more resources to make the most of your GIS career. I'll go ahead and stop sharing and just check. We do have one more question to close us out, as a matter of fact. So Jennifer asked in the chat, for you, Breece, how do you see the intersection between AI and traditional ecological knowledge playing out over the next few years? Both AI and TEK are movements with a lot of momentum, but they seem at odds in their approaches.
Yes, I have noticed that too. One thing I have noted is that I haven't seen a lot of work trying to integrate the concepts and practices of TEK into AI algorithms. And so that kind of goes back to some of those biases that are out there in the current way that AI and machine learning algorithms are being constructed. But I think maybe that's a good topic for a panel, Wendy. That's something that GPN could lead, but I think we definitely do need to address sort of the divides in AI and not only TEK, but also community engagement and just local perspectives. That sort of qualitative perspective component is not getting into some of the modeling that's happening now and figure out how that does get integrated.
Thank you, Breece. That's a really great response. And I agree, it could be discussed in a future webinar or webinars plural. It's definitely a complex and important topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, I would like to once again thank everybody for coming, and huge round of applause to Breece again for the wonderful presentation. I know I was very inspired. I'm sure everyone here was as well, and those who couldn't be here live but will be reviewing it after will have so much to gain. So thank you for sharing all of your expertise and knowledge and passion with us. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and hope to see you soon at future GPN events.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.